I looked my 35-year-old son right in the eyes. My hands were trembling as I delivered the hardest words a father could ever say. I told him I had lost everything. I said the market had crashed. I told him my offshore investments were completely wiped out, and I was absolutely broke. I looked down at the table and whispered that we had to sell the family estate just so I could survive. I waited for the shock. I waited for him to reach across the table. I wanted him to hold my hand, to tell me that we would get through this together because we were family. Instead, the corners of his mouth curled into a slow, calculating smile. His eyes lit up with a predatory excitement I had never seen before. He leaned back in his chair, let out a deep breath, and muttered a single word. Finally. I have been waiting for this. What he did not know, what he could not possibly have imagined, was that I was not broke at all. My $50 million fortune was perfectly secure. It was hidden away in blind trusts that he had absolutely no access to. The entire breakdown was a test. It was a desperate, painful test to see if the boy I raised would catch his father when he fell. And the very next morning, the nightmare got significantly worse. I was standing in the kitchen, hidden by the morning shadows, when I overheard him on the back patio. He was on the phone frantically discussing a $40 million buyout of my property with a shadow buyer. He was planning to pocket the money, pay off a massive illegal debt, and force me into a state-run nursing home where I would be entirely forgotten. But here is the twist that will make your jaw drop. What my greedy, arrogant son did not know was that the anonymous shadow buyer he was so desperately trying to sell my land to was actually me. My name is Harrison Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and I live high up in the crisp mountain air of Denver, Colorado. I spent 40 years of my life building a massive infrastructure and logistics firm from the ground up. I did not inherit a single dime. I worked 80-hour weeks. I poured concrete. I negotiated cutthroat contracts. I sacrificed my own sleep and health so that my family would never have to know the true meaning of the word struggle. When I finally retired, I stepped away with a massive fortune, but you would never know it by looking at me. I live a quiet, humble life on a 500-acre legacy estate, surrounded by towering pine trees and absolute silence. It is a breathtakingly beautiful place, but it has felt entirely too big and too empty ever since my beloved wife, Patricia, passed away 5 years ago. Patricia was the absolute heart of our family. She was the warm glue that kept everything and everyone together. Since she left this world, the silence in these big, empty rooms has been absolutely deafening. We only had one child, our son Derek. He is 35, now married to a woman named Monica, who is 33. They live a life that looks absolutely perfect on social media. They drive luxury cars they lease. They wear designer clothes they buy on credit. They attend exclusive parties to impress people they do not even genuinely like. For years, I have been their silent, dependable safety net. Whenever Derek made a terrible business investment, I wrote a check to bail him out. Whenever Monica overspent on a lavish European vacation, I quietly paid the credit card bill to save them from financial ruin. I did it because I loved my son. I wanted to give him the world. But lately, things had started to drastically change. The requests for money were no longer polite, hesitant asks. They were becoming aggressive demands. Derek started calling them bridge loans, though we both knew he had absolutely no intention of ever paying me back. But worse than the financial drain was the subtle, constant disrespect. They started visiting the estate more often, but it was never really to see me. They would walk through the halls measuring the large rooms with their eyes. They would talk loudly about how outdated the antique furniture was. Monica would look at me with this thinly veiled annoyance, sighing loudly whenever I asked her a simple question about her day. Derek started dropping heavy, manipulative hints that the property was simply too much for a frail old man to handle alone. He would pull me aside and say things like, "Dad, you are getting weak. You should really think about downsizing your life." Let me manage the assets so you do not have to stress your heart out. The disrespect was like a slow-acting poison. It ate away at my soul day after day. I started to wonder if my son actually loved me, or if he just loved the walking ATM machine I had become. I needed to know the absolute truth. I needed to know what kind of man I had raised. So I devised a plan, a test. It was a risky, deeply painful idea, but I had to know exactly where I stood in his eyes. I invited Derek and Monica over for a quiet dinner on a chilly Tuesday night. I spent the entire afternoon preparing myself mentally and physically for the performance of a lifetime. I deliberately messed up my gray hair. I put on an old, deeply wrinkled shirt. I did not shave my face. When they arrived, I made sure to walk a little slower, letting my shoulders slump forward heavily. I wanted to look like a broken man who had the literal weight of the world crushing down on his chest. We sat down in the grand formal dining room. The room was dimly lit by a single chandelier. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Monica was completely disengaged, busy scrolling on her phone and barely acknowledging my presence. Derek was aggressively cutting his steak, complaining loudly about the heavy traffic on the drive up the mountain. I took a very deep breath. I let my hands shake visibly against the polished mahogany table. I looked down at my cold plate, swallowed hard, and forced my voice to crack with raw emotion. Derek, I need to talk to you. It is incredibly serious. He paused, his silver fork stopping halfway to his mouth. He looked at me, mildly annoyed. What is it, Dad? Did the lawn care company mess up the billing again? I shook my head slowly, looking up at him with real tears brimming in my tired eyes. I put everything into an offshore commercial real estate fund. The broker promised me guaranteed massive returns. But it was a massive scam, Derek. The fund totally collapsed yesterday morning. Everything is gone. I am completely broke. Monica stopped scrolling instantly. Her glowing phone slowly lowered to the table. She stared at me, her mouth hanging slightly open in pure shock. Derek put his fork down slowly. The mild annoyance on his face vanished entirely, replaced by a rigid, ice-cold stillness. What do you mean, broke? You have millions of dollars, Dad. You have massive retirement accounts. I wiped a fake tear from my wrinkled cheek. It is all tied up in the collapse. The bank is calling in the collateral right now. I have a mountain of aggressive debt that I absolutely cannot cover. The only way out, the only way to avoid federal prison and complete ruin is to sell this estate. I have to sell the land, the house, everything. I have nothing left, son. I desperately need your help. I sat there, in the heavy silence, holding my breath, my elderly heart breaking inside my chest. I waited for my boy to step up to the plate. I waited for him to say that it was going to be okay. That he made good money now, that he and Monica would take me into their home, that I would never have to worry about a single thing as long as he was alive. I prayed to God in that terrible moment that my son would prove my darkest doubts wrong. But God was not listening to me that night. Derek did not reach out to comfort his weeping father. He did not offer a single solitary word of reassurance. Instead, he leaned back slowly in his expensive chair. He looked around the grand dining room, his eyes greedily scanning the expensive artwork and the towering high ceilings. A slow, terrifying smile spread across his face. It was the exact smile of a hungry predator watching its prey bleed out in the snow. He let out a long, deeply satisfied sigh. Finally. The word hung in the air, sharp and cold as a butcher's blade. I stared at him, my blood running like ice water through my veins. What did you just say? Derek chuckled softly, shaking his head with a smirk. I said finally, Dad, I have been waiting for this. Do you know how incredibly exhausting it has been watching you hoard this massive property while we struggled to build our own lives? You are sitting on a literal goldmine doing absolutely nothing with it. Selling this place is the best thing that could ever possibly happen. Monica chimed in immediately, her voice dripping with fake sugary sympathy, but her eyes shining with pure, unadulterated greed. It really is for the best, Harrison. You are much too old to be managing all this empty space anyway. It is honestly a massive relief for everyone. I could not speak. The sharp pain in my chest was so severe, I thought I might actually be having a heart attack. My own flesh and blood. The boy I had patiently taught to ride a bike, the boy I had stayed up with through midnight fevers and teenage heartbreaks, was sitting right across from me, openly celebrating my utter destruction. You are glad. I whispered, my voice barely audible in the large room. I am telling you I am financially ruined, and you are actually glad. Derek stood up abruptly from the table, tossing his linen napkin down carelessly. Do not be dramatic, Dad. You had a really good run. You lived a great life, but it is time to face reality. You messed up big time, and now you have to liquidate. I will step in and handle the sale. You are clearly not in the right state of mind to negotiate a real estate deal of this magnitude. I will bring some transfer paperwork by tomorrow morning. He did not ask where I would live. He did not ask how I would afford basic food or essential medical care. He did not offer me a spare room in his massive luxury house. He simply saw a wounded animal, and he immediately moved in for the final kill. They left the house shortly after that. They did not even bother to finish their dinner. They were way too eager, too excited to get back to their car and start making aggressive plans for my demise. I sat completely alone in the dark dining room for a very long time. The silence in the house felt entirely different now. It was no longer just a lonely silence. It was hostile. I looked up at the oil portrait of my late wife, Patricia, hanging elegantly above the stone fireplace. I am sorry, Pat, I whispered into the empty room. I am so terribly sorry for what our boy has become. I slowly went up to my bedroom, but I did not sleep a single wink that night. My sadness was slowly burning away, evaporating into a cold, hard, unstoppable fury. Derek thought I was a weak, confused old man who had completely lost his touch. He thought he had me perfectly backed into an inescapable corner. He had absolutely no idea that he had just awakened a sleeping giant. He had no idea that I still had $50 million perfectly safe in the bank. And he certainly had no idea that his arrogant celebration was going to cost him his freedom, his marriage, and his entire future. The test was over, and my son had completely failed. I pushed myself away from the dining table. My legs felt like lead. The grand house suddenly felt like a tomb. I walked down the long hallway toward my private study. Every step echoed, amplifying the absolute emptiness of the estate. I reached the heavy oak doors of the study and pushed them open. The room was dark, illuminated only by the pale moonlight filtering through the tall windows. I did not bother to turn on the lamps. The darkness matched the hollow ache spreading through my chest. I walked over to the small wet bar in the corner, my hands still trembling slightly, and poured myself 2 fingers of neat bourbon. I did not drink it right away. I simply held the heavy crystal glass, feeling the coldness seep into my skin. I moved to my leather armchair, the one sitting directly across from the large fireplace. Above the mantel hung a beautiful oil painting of Patricia. Her painted eyes looked down at me with that familiar, gentle warmth that used to make every bad day instantly better. I stared at her for a long time. I wanted her to speak to me. I wanted her to step out of that frame, put her hand on my shoulder, and tell me that everything was going to be all right. But there was only silence. Pat, I whispered to the empty room. What happened to our boy? What did we do wrong? The sound of my own voice breaking in the quiet room was pathetic. I took a slow sip of the bourbon, letting the burn slide down my throat, hoping it would numb the sharp pain in my heart. I leaned my head back against the leather and closed my eyes. A father's mind is a desperate thing. It twists logic into impossible shapes just to protect the image of his child. I started making excuses for him. I told myself that Derek was simply in shock. People say terrible, thoughtless things when they are panicked. Yes, that had to be it. He was terrified. I had just dropped a massive bomb on him. I had told him that his indestructible father, the man who had always been the ultimate safety net, was suddenly ruined. The word finally was just a defense mechanism. It was a nervous reaction. He did not literally mean he was happy I was bankrupt. He was overwhelmed by the sudden shift in reality. Maybe he meant that finally the secret was out, and we could start dealing with the problem. I clutched the glass, trying with all my might to believe those desperate lies. I wanted to believe that tomorrow morning, Derek would walk through the front door with a cup of coffee, sit down across from me and apologize for being so callous. I wanted to believe he would take care of me, that he loved me more than the inheritance he was expecting. I spent hours sitting in that chair, staring into the dead fireplace, building a fragile fortress of denial around my breaking heart. I told myself that the boy who used to fall asleep on my chest while we watched baseball games could not possibly be the same man who just smiled at my destruction. It was just a bad night, a terrible misunderstanding. But as the hours ticked by and the moonlight shifted across the floor, the fortress of denial began to crack. The truth was too heavy, and the history between us was too clear. I opened my eyes and looked at Patricia again. She had warned me. She had always warned me. I remembered a conversation we had when Derek was just a teenager. He had wrecked his first car, a brand new sports car I had bought for his 16th birthday, because he was driving recklessly. He did not even apologize. He just asked when the replacement would arrive. Patricia had looked at me with deep concern and said, "Harrison, you cannot just buy him a new one. He has to learn that actions have consequences. If you keep sweeping away his mistakes with your checkbook, he will never learn how to stand on his own 2 feet." But I did not listen. I thought providing meant protecting him from every hardship. I grew up with absolutely nothing. I wore shoes with holes in the soles and went to bed hungry more times than I could count. I made a vow that my son would never know that kind of pain. So I bought him a new car, and that became the pattern of our entire lives. When he failed out of his first business venture in his 20s, blowing through $200,000 of seed money, I did not make him get a regular job to pay it off. I simply wrote another check. I wiped the slate clean. I told myself he was just young and finding his way. When he wanted an extravagant wedding that cost more than most people make in a decade, I paid for it without a second thought. I paid for his expensive new luxury cars every time he grew bored with the old ones. I paid for the massive down payment on his luxury home simply because he asked. I paid off Monica's insane credit card debts when they lived far beyond their means. I did it all because I desperately believed that my endless generosity would eventually buy his maturity and his respect. I believed that if I gave him enough of the world, he would eventually learn to appreciate it. Sitting there alone in the silent dark, the cold and brutal reality finally washed over me completely. I had not protected my son. I had ruined him. By removing every single obstacle from his path, I had stripped away his ability to develop empathy, resilience, or gratitude. I had built a dangerous monster of pure entitlement, brick by brick and check by check. He absolutely did not see me as a loving father anymore. I was just an overgrown bank account that was taking too long to close. The bourbon in my glass was completely gone, but I did not pour another. The strong alcohol could not even begin to numb this kind of deep, devastating failure. I had failed as a father, not because I gave too little, but because I gave entirely too much. The clock on the wall chimed softly. It was 4 in the morning. The sky outside the large windows was just beginning to turn a pale, bruised purple. Dawn was finally coming. My body ached from sitting in the same position for hours, but my mind was suddenly sharp and completely clear. The heavy veil of denial was completely gone. All the desperate excuses were completely burned away. I knew I had to face whatever came next with my eyes wide open. I set the crystal glass down on the side table and slowly pushed myself up from the leather armchair. I walked over to the window and looked out at the vast, silent estate. I did not know exactly what the harsh new day would bring, but I knew in my heart that my life would absolutely never be the same again. The real test had just begun. The sun broke over the Colorado mountains, casting long, sharp shadows across the expansive grounds of the estate. I had not slept a single minute during the long night. I walked down the grand staircase, my joints aching, my mind racing with the brutal revelations of the night before. I desperately needed a strong cup of black coffee. I needed something bitter and hot to ground me in this horrifying new reality. The kitchen was massive, all dark granite and polished stainless steel. A space that was usually filled with the warmth of Patricia humming softly while she cooked our morning meals. Now it was just cold, empty, and unwelcoming. I walked over to the heavy espresso machine, moving quietly out of pure, ingrained habit. I did not want to wake Derek and Monica in the guest wing. I did not want to look at their greedy faces just yet. I needed time to process my grief and figure out my next move. As I pressed the silver button on the machine, the soft grinding of coffee beans filled the silence of the room. Then I heard it. A voice. It was low, frantic, and coming from the stone patio right outside the heavy glass kitchen doors. I froze in place. The voice belonged to Derek. He was awake much earlier than usual. He was a man who deeply cherished his sleep, often complaining loudly if he was forced to rise before 9 in the morning. Yet here he was, pacing aggressively back and forth in the crisp morning air, his breath forming small white clouds in the biting cold. I stepped back slowly into the deep shadows of the walk-in pantry, pressing my spine against the cool plaster wall. I left the coffee machine completely alone. Something in his tone, a desperate, sharp edge that I had absolutely never heard him use around me, made all the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up. I edged closer to the slightly cracked glass door. The gap was barely an inch wide, just enough to let the freezing morning breeze slip through, but it was wide enough for me to hear every single word with terrifying clarity. "Listen to me, you need to calm down." Derek hissed fiercely into his cell phone, rubbing his free hand vigorously over his face. "I told you, I have it completely under control." The old man took the bait last night. He swallowed the whole story without a single question. He is entirely convinced he is bankrupt. He thinks his offshore accounts got wiped out in a market crash. He practically cried at the dinner table. My heart completely stopped beating. The air in my lungs turned to solid ice. He was not talking to a friend. He was not talking to his wife. I was reporting to someone dangerous. The absolute unfiltered malice in his voice was truly sickening. He did not sound like the son I had raised. He sounded like a ruthless, calculating stranger. I held my breath, terrified that the slightest sound of my breathing would give me away. Derek continued pacing on the patio, his expensive leather slippers clicking sharply against the stone pavers. "I am telling you, the plan is set in stone." Derek said, his voice rising slightly in panic, before he forcefully shoved it back down into a harsh whisper. "I am stepping in as the hero today. I am going to generously buy this entire estate through my private holding company. I will offer him $2 million in cash to save his life. He thinks he is desperate, so he will sign the deed over to me just to clear his fake debt. He actually thinks I am doing him a massive favor." My stomach violently churned. $2 million. The estate, with its sprawling 500 acres of prime Colorado real estate, was easily worth $40 million. He was going to steal the land from his own father for a pathetic fraction of its true value. But what he said next completely shattered my world into a million jagged pieces. "Once the deed is securely in my name." Derek continued, his voice trembling with a disgusting mix of fear and greedy excitement. "We immediately flipped the property to Zenith Corporation. They have been trying to acquire this specific plot for months to build their new Western distribution hub. They are willing to pay the full $40 million right now. You will get the $12 million I owe the syndicate by the end of the month. The cartel gets their money back in full with interest, and you guys leave me and Monica alone forever. I walk away completely clean and nobody gets hurt. The blood pounded in my ears so loudly, I thought my head would physically burst open. $12 million. The cartel. Zenith Corporation. The words spun around me like a violent, suffocating tornado. My son, the boy I had sheltered from every minor inconvenience, his entire life was deeply embedded with a violent, illegal gambling syndicate. He had racked up a $12 million debt, and his brilliant escape plan was to rob his grieving father blind. He was going to buy my home, my sacred sanctuary, for pennies and sell it to a massive corporate giant just to save his own skin. And he was going to pretend he was my savior the entire time, but the betrayal did not end there. I remained frozen against the wall, listening as the conversation took an even darker turn. The person on the other end of the line must have asked what would happen to me after the sale, because Derek let out a cold, heartless laugh. "Do not worry about the old man," Derek sneered into the phone. "Once the ink is dry on the deed, I have a private doctor lined up in Denver. For a small fee, he is going to examine my father and declare him legally incompetent. The stress of the bankruptcy will be the perfect excuse for his sudden mental decline. I will get full power of attorney by the end of the week. Then we are going to dump him in that cheap state-run nursing home downtown, the one that smells like bleach and despair. He will not even remember his own name by Christmas. It is the perfect solution. He gets out of our way, and Monica and I take our cut of the Zenith deal and move to Europe." I squeezed my eyes shut as hot, angry tears burned down my cheeks. He was not just stealing my money. I was planning to steal my freedom, my dignity, and my mind. He wanted to lock me away in a miserable facility where I would rot in isolation just so he could enjoy the spoils of my lifetime of hard work. As Derek ended the call and walked back inside, completely unaware of my presence in the shadows, a strange transformation happened inside me. The sorrow, the grief, the desperate need to protect my boy instantly vanished. They were replaced by an icy, calculated fury. My son thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess against an absolutely clueless, broken old man. He thought he had outsmarted me. But what my greedy, arrogant son did not know was that I was the silent majority shareholder of the parent company that owned Zenith Corporation. He was trying to sell my own land back to me. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, but the realization of the power I held settled into my bones like armor. He wanted to play a ruthless game. I was about to learn that I wrote the rules, and I was going to destroy his entire world before he even saw it coming. The morning sun crept over the jagged peaks of the Colorado mountains, pouring a harsh, blinding light into my study. I stood by the window for a long time, watching the frost melt off the massive pine trees. I felt a deep, heavy exhaustion settling into my bones, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. The real test had just begun. I turned away from the glass, my joints protesting, as I made my way down the long, silent hallway toward the kitchen. I needed to be sitting at the breakfast table when they arrived. I needed the stage to be perfectly set. I poured myself a simple cup of black coffee and sat at the head of the heavy oak table. The house was entirely too quiet. I stared at the dark liquid in my mug, preparing myself for the hardest performance of my entire life. I had to look like a man who had absolutely nothing left to live for. I let my shoulders droop forward. I allowed the exhaustion of the sleepless night to fully show on my face. I practiced making my hands tremble slightly as I lifted the coffee mug to my lips. Footsteps echoed down the grand staircase. Derek and Monica were awake. I could hear the soft, deliberate rhythm of their steps as they approached the kitchen. They walked into the room, and I had to use every single ounce of my willpower to keep my expression completely neutral. Monica was wearing a pristine white cashmere sweater, her hair perfectly styled, looking entirely out of place in a mountain estate. Derek followed closely behind her, wearing a crisp button-down shirt, looking like the ultimate professional. They stopped when they saw me sitting alone at the table. I slowly raised my head, making sure my eyes looked red and defeated. "Good morning," I whispered, my voice sounding weak and frail. Derek walked over and pulled out the chair directly to my left. He sat down close to me, much closer than he usually did. Monica took a seat across the table, folding her manicured hands neatly in front of her. She put on a look of deep, exaggerated concern. It was a masterful performance on her part, but I could see the cold calculation hiding just behind her eyes. Derek reached out across the dark wood of the table. He placed his warm, firm hand directly over my trembling one. It took a massive amount of physical restraint not to snatch my hand away. I wanted to grab him by the collar. I wanted to shake him until he confessed everything. I wanted to strangle the son I had raised for treating me like a disposable burden. But I stayed perfectly still. I forced my hand to shake slightly beneath his grip. "Dad," Derek began, his voice dropping into a low, soothing tone. His delivery was absolutely flawless. It was the tone of a deeply caring, responsible son stepping up to save his family. I could not stop thinking about our conversation last night. I did not sleep at all. Monica and I stayed up for hours trying to figure out a solution. "We are not going to let you go bankrupt. We are not going to let the bank take everything you have worked for." I looked up at him, forcing a desperate, hopeful expression onto my face. "What do you mean, Derek?" I asked, letting my voice crack with manufactured emotion. "The debt is massive. It is completely insurmountable. There is absolutely no way out of this disaster." Derek squeezed my hand a little tighter. He leaned in closer, holding my gaze with absolute, unblinking confidence. "Yes, there is," he said smoothly. "I have a very close investor friend in Denver. He specializes in buying distressed luxury properties quickly in cash. I called him first thing this morning and explained your situation. I begged him to help us out. He is willing to buy the entire estate for $2 million. $2 million. The audacity of the lie was breathtaking. He was offering me $2 million for 500 acres of prime real estate that we both knew was worth at least $40 million. And he was packaging this blatant robbery as a generous act of salvation. I stared at him, feeling the absolute darkness of his soul radiating across the table. He was going to steal my home, sell it to the cartel shadow buyer, and walk away with a massive fortune while leaving me with nothing but pennies. That is well above the actual distressed value of the property right now. Derek continued, his voice perfectly calm and reasonable. "It will be more than enough cash to pay off your aggressive offshore debts and keep you entirely out of federal prison. You will be completely clear, Dad. The nightmare will be over." "But where will I go?" I whispered, letting a single calculated tear slip down my cheek. "This house is everything I have left of your mother." This was the moment Monica decided to join the performance. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You will come live with us, Harrison. We have already talked about it. We will set up a beautiful room for you in our house. We will make sure you are comfortable and safe. You will not have to worry about managing a massive estate anymore. We will take care of everything for you from now on." The image of them locking me away in a state-run facility flashed vividly in my mind. I remembered the overheard phone call. I remembered his cruel laughter as he talked about my mind fading away by Christmas. The urge to reach across the table and destroy him right there was nearly overpowering. My chest physically ached from holding back the storm of pure rage boiling inside me. But I knew that if I broke character now, I would lose the entire war. I needed him to believe he had won. I needed him to feel absolutely invincible. I pulled my trembling hand out from under his and used it to wipe the fake tear from my cheek. I let out a long, ragged sigh, letting my shoulders slump even further forward. I nodded my head, slowly painting a picture of absolute surrender. You really think this friend of yours can do this quickly? I asked, my voice barely a fragile. Derek smiled. It was a warm, reassuring smile that masked the venom running through his veins. I know he can, Dad. I will have the transfer paperwork drawn up by my private legal team this afternoon. We can sign everything by Friday. You just need to rest and let me handle the heavy lifting. I am going to take care of the paperwork, the lawyers, and the bank. You do not have to stress your heart anymore. Thank you, Derek, I said softly. Thank you for stepping up. I do not know what I would do without you. He patted my arm affectionately, completely unaware that he had just sealed his own fate. Do not worry about a thing, Dad. I have got it all completely under control. Do not worry about a thing, Dad. I have got it all completely under control. Derek stood up from the table, smoothed the front of his crisp shirt, and walked out the front door to supposedly meet with his elite legal team. I watched him leave, feeling the heavy silence of the kitchen press down on my shoulders. I expected Monica to immediately retreat to the guest wing, to bury her face in her glowing phone and pretend I did not exist. That was her daily routine. She usually floated through my home like a ghost who found the living entirely too bothersome to acknowledge. But as the heavy front door clicked shut, her entire demeanor shifted in a way that made my skin crawl. She turned toward me, a bright, deeply unnatural smile stretching across her face. She walked over to the sink, picked up a damp cloth, and began wiping the immaculate granite countertops. Harrison, you look absolutely exhausted, she said, her voice dripping with a thick, sugary sweetness that I had never heard her use before. You really need to take better care of yourself during this stressful transition. We cannot have you collapsing on us before everything is finalized. For the rest of the day, she hovered around me like a dedicated nurse. It was suffocating. If I walked into the living room to read a book, she followed me with a plush throw blanket and tucked it tightly around my legs. If I stood up to pour a simple glass of water, she intercepted me, insisting that I sit back down while she fetched it. She was playing the role of the devoted daughter-in-law so aggressively that it felt like a poorly written stage play. But I knew the truth. She was guarding me. She was making absolutely sure that I did not touch a telephone call an old friend or reach out to any financial advisors who might accidentally reveal the reality of my bank accounts. She was keeping me isolated inside a padded, comfortable cell of her own making. I played along perfectly. I thanked her for every small gesture. I let my hands shake. I stared blankly out the window, acting like a man whose spirit had been completely broken by the crushing weight of a massive financial failure. When the sun finally dipped below the rugged mountain peaks, casting the grand estate into deep creeping shadows, I retreated to my study. I sat in my favorite leather armchair by the unlit fireplace, pretending to mourn my lost fortune. The heavy oak door creaked open, and Monica stepped inside. She was holding a tall, frosted glass filled with a thick, pale green liquid. She walked over to my chair with slow, deliberate steps. I noticed she was watching my face very closely. Harrison, I made you something special, she whispered gently, handing me the cold glass. I have been researching natural remedies for severe anxiety and insomnia. This is an herbal protein smoothie. It is packed with raw vitamins, organic chamomile, and a few special root extracts that will help calm your racing heart. You have been through a massive trauma today, and you desperately need a deep, uninterrupted night of sleep. I want you to drink every last drop. It will make you feel better tomorrow. I looked down at the pale green liquid. It smelled vaguely of mint and something sharp, something faintly metallic that I could not quite identify. I had absolutely no reason to suspect she was poisoning me. At that moment, I just thought it was another one of her ridiculous, overpriced wellness fads. I assumed she was just trying to keep me docile and quiet, while Derek forged the fake transfer deeds. I wanted to keep up the charade of the helpless, dependent elder. So I forced a weak, grateful smile and raised the heavy glass to my lips. Thank you, Monica, I muttered, my voice appropriately frail. You are being much too kind to me. She stood there in the dim light of the study, her arms crossed over her chest, watching me intently as I swallowed the thick liquid. It tasted bitter and chalky, but I forced it down, draining the glass completely. Excellent, she said, taking the empty glass from my trembling fingers. Now let us get you up to bed. I allowed her to guide me up the grand staircase. By the time I reached the top step, my legs were already beginning to feel strangely heavy. It was not the normal fatigue of a 70-year-old man. It was a dense, creeping paralysis that seemed to start in my bones and radiate outward into my muscles. My vision blurred slightly at the edges. The long hallway seemed to stretch out endlessly in front of me, the walls tilting at unnatural angles. I stumbled into my master bedroom and practically collapsed onto the mattress. I barely had enough energy to pull the thick duvet over my chest. My eyelids felt like they were made of solid lead. The last thing I heard before slipping into a deep, dark void was the soft, muffled sound of my bedroom door clicking shut and the faint, rhythmic tapping of Monica walking away down the hardwood hallway. I woke up the next morning feeling like my brain had been violently submerged in thick, freezing mud. The morning sunlight was piercingly bright, stabbing through the curtains and burning my eyes. I tried to lift my head off the pillow, but the room immediately spun in violent, sickening circles. A heavy, suffocating fog filled every corner of my mind. I could not remember what day it was. For a terrifying, endless minute, I could not even remember my own name. Panic flared in my chest, hot and desperate, but my body refused to respond to the frantic commands of my brain. I forced myself to sit up on the edge of the large bed. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking uncontrollably. It was not the fake, calculated tremor I had been acting out the day before. This was a severe, violent neurological spasm. My fingers jerked and twitched with a terrifying mind of their own. I desperately tried to stand, but my knees buckled instantly, sending me crashing against the wooden nightstand. I gasped for air, my heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against my ribs. My mouth was incredibly dry, tasting of rust and bitter chemicals. I dragged myself across the carpet, gripping the heavy dresser, to pull my trembling body upright. I caught a glimpse of myself in the tall vanity mirror. The reflection staring back at me was a horrifying stranger. My skin was pale and covered in a cold sweat. My eyes were completely vacant and deeply sunken into my skull. A slow, horrifying realization pierced through the thick chemical fog. Monica had not given me a simple wellness drink. She had deliberately poisoned my poor, fading mind today. They were turning me into a defenseless, hollow shell of a human being, entirely incapable of fighting back against their sinister, calculating greed. I closed my eyes and wept silently. When I finally pulled myself up from the floor, every muscle in my body screamed in protest. I forced myself to walk toward the bathroom, leaning heavily against the wall for support. The man staring back at me in the mirror was completely unrecognizable. My skin was a ghastly shade of gray. My eyes were bloodshot and darting around the room, struggling to focus on simple shapes. The chemical fog in my brain made it incredibly difficult to form a complete thought. I splashed freezing cold water onto my face, hoping the sudden shock would clear my mind. It barely helped. I needed fresh air. I needed to get out of this suffocating house before the walls closed in on me. I stumbled down the grand staircase, gripping the mahogany railing so tightly my knuckles turned white. The house was entirely silent, but it was not a peaceful silence. It was the predatory silence of a trap waiting to snap shut. I managed to reach the heavy oak front doors and pushed my way out onto the wraparound porch. The biting mountain air hit my lungs like a physical blow. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold wind on my face. I decided to walk toward the main access road, hoping the physical exertion would force the thick poison out of my bloodstream. I wandered down the winding gravel driveway, my feet dragging heavily against the loose stones. The towering pine trees that usually brought me so much peace now felt like silent wardens watching my slow demise. As I rounded the final bend, approaching the main iron gates of the estate, my clouded vision caught something completely out of place. 3 large black sport utility vehicles were parked aggressively along the edge of my property line. They were not local vehicles. They did not belong to any neighbors or contractors I had ever hired. 4 men were standing near the heavy iron gates. They were dressed in sharp, dark suits that fit poorly over their muscular frames. They looked like men who broke bones for a living. One of them was holding a large roll of architectural blueprints, pointing aggressively toward the eastern ridge of my land. Another man was holding a digital surveying device, actively mapping out the boundaries of my sanctuary. They were already planning the grand demolition process. They were already dividing up the spoils of my life before the ink on the fake transfer deed was even dry. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. The syndicate was already here. Derek had promised them the land, and they were not waiting for the legal formalities to begin taking inventory. I wanted to demand they get off my property immediately, but my throat was completely dry and my legs refused to carry me any closer. Before I could muster the strength to take another step, I heard the crunching of gravel behind me. I turned around slowly, my balance shifting dangerously. Derek was walking toward me. He was wearing a thick cashmere coat, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He did not look angry. He looked perfectly, terrifyingly calm. I pointed a trembling finger toward the dark vehicles near the gate. Derek. I stammered, my voice sounding incredibly weak and slurred. Who are those men? What are they doing by the main gate? Tell them they have absolutely no right to be on my land. I have not signed anything yet. Derek stopped a few feet away from me. He looked exactly where I was pointing. He stared at the men at the black vehicles, and then he slowly turned his head to look back at me. His expression was a flawless mask of deep, pitying sorrow. He stepped closer and placed a warm, firm hand on my trembling shoulder. Dad, there is no one there, he said softly, his voice dripping with manufactured concern. You are just pointing at the empty road. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear the heavy chemical fog from my eyes. I looked back at the gate. The men were still there. One of them even glanced in our direction, making direct eye contact with Derek for a split second before looking away. They were absolutely real. I looked back at my son, panic rising in my chest like a tidal wave. They are right there, Derek. I wheezed, my voice cracking with desperation. The men in the dark suits. They have blueprints. Derek shook his head slowly, squeezing my shoulder with a tight, commanding grip. You are just confused from the severe stress, Dad. The financial shock is playing terrible tricks on your mind. You are completely hallucinating right now. This is exactly why you cannot manage things on your own anymore. Let us get you back inside and back to bed. Monica will make you another one of her special smoothies to help you calm down. The absolute terror of his words hit me harder than any physical blow ever could. He was looking directly at a group of dangerous men standing on my property, and he was telling me with a completely straight face that they did not exist. He was deliberately using the poison running through my veins to shatter my grip on reality. I stood there shivering in the freezing mountain wind, feeling entirely trapped inside my own failing body. If I argued with him, if I insisted that the men were real, I would only be giving him more ammunition to prove that my mind was completely gone. He would use my own desperate protests to speed up the process of declaring me legally incompetent. He wanted me to sound crazy. He needed me to sound crazy. Every single piece of his dark, sinister puzzle was perfectly snapping into place. I let my trembling arm fall back to my aching side. I forced my eyes to drop to the gravel driveway, breaking eye contact with his cold, calculating stare. I allowed my shoulders to slump forward in total defeat. You are right, I whispered, my voice intentionally fragile and broken. I am so tired, Derek. My mind is playing terrible tricks on me today. I just want to go back inside and lie down. I am so terribly confused. Derek smiled. It was a subtle, deeply sinister smile that barely touched the corners of his mouth. He wrapped his arm securely around my shoulders, guiding me back toward the massive front doors of the estate. "Of course, Dad," he murmured softly. "I have got you. You just need to trust me. I am going to take care of absolutely everything. We will have the paperwork ready for you to sign by Friday morning. Then you can finally rest without all this terrible burden weighing you down." As he guided me up the front steps, the terrifying brilliance of his plan became completely clear to me. The poisonous smoothies were not just meant to make me physically weak. They were specifically designed to destroy my cognitive function so that I could not read or comprehend the legal contracts I was about to sign. Derek was manufacturing my severe dementia in real time to lock me away. He was stealing my life. The rest of the day passed in a blur of manufactured helplessness. I sat in my study staring blankly at the fireplace. Every time Derek walked past, I made sure to look entirely lost. The effort to maintain this facade was exhausting, but entirely necessary. I had to make them believe their poison was working. As the evening shadows lengthened across the hardwood floors, swallowing the sunlight, I slowly made my way up the grand staircase to my master bedroom. I climbed into the heavy bed, pulling the thick duvet up to my chest, and waited for the nightly ritual to begin. I did not have to wait long. The heavy oak door creaked open, and Monica stepped into the dim room. The glow of the hallway light framed her silhouette, making her look like a dark specter. She was holding that familiar frosted glass, the pale green liquid swirling slightly as she walked toward my bedside table. Her face was arranged into that sickeningly sweet mask of artificial concern. "Harrison." "I brought your herbal smoothie," she whispered, her voice gliding smoothly through the quiet room. "You had a very rough morning outside. Your nerves are shot. You need to drink every drop of this so you can rest." I slowly turned my head on the pillow, letting my eyes glaze over. I reached out with a violently shaking hand, fumbling blindly for the glass. Monica let out a soft, impatient sigh and placed the cold glass directly into my trembling grip. "Thank you, Monica," I mumbled, slurring my words heavily. "You take such good care of me. I do not know what I would do without you." A terrifying, genuine smile flashed across her face for a fraction of a second. "Just drink it, Harrison," she said softly. I brought the edge of the glass to my lips. I tilted it back, allowing the bitter liquid to pool in my mouth, but I tightly closed my throat, refusing to swallow a drop. I let a small amount dribble down my chin, soaking into the thick linen napkin I had tucked into my collar. I closed my eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath, lowering the half-empty glass back to my lap. "I cannot finish it," I whispered weakly. "I am just too tired to swallow anymore." Monica stared at me for a long moment. She looked at the spilled liquid on my napkin, then at my drooping eyelids. She decided I had ingested enough of the heavy sedative to keep me incapacitated for the night. "Very well," she murmured, taking the glass from my hands and setting it on the nightstand. "Rest now. Tomorrow is a very big day." She turned on her heel, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet, and pulled the bedroom door firmly shut behind her. The second the latch clicked into place, my eyes snapped wide open. I threw the heavy duvet off my chest and sat up. I carefully spat the bitter metallic-tasting liquid from my mouth, directly into the soaked linen napkin. My heart was racing, but my movements were precise and deliberate. I reached under the heavy wooden frame of my bed and pulled out a large stainless steel thermos I had hidden there earlier. I grabbed the half-full glass from the nightstand and poured the remaining pale green poison directly into the metal container. I twisted the cap on tightly and shoved the thermos deep into the darkest corner beneath the bed structure. I wiped my mouth clean and stared up at the dark ceiling. The night stretched on in absolute silence. I did not sleep. I lay perfectly still, listening to the faint sounds of the mountain wind rattling the large window panes. As the hours slowly ticked by, a miraculous, undeniable change began to take place inside my body. The heavy, suffocating weight that had been pressing down on my chest for days slowly began to evaporate. The thick, toxic mud that had clogged every corner of my mind was gradually washing away, leaving behind a sharp, breathtaking clarity. By the time the first pale rays of dawn began to bleed through the curtains, the violent tremors in my hands had completely vanished. I held my fingers up in the morning light. They were perfectly still. They were strong. The poison was finally leaving my system entirely. I slowly pushed myself out of bed and stood up. My legs did not buckle. My knees did not shake. I walked across the room to the tall vanity mirror and looked at the man staring back at me. The ghastly, hollow-eyed ghost from the previous morning was completely gone. The blood had returned to my cheeks. The sharp, piercing focus had returned to my eyes. I was no longer a confused, helpless old man waiting to be led to the slaughter. I was Harrison Caldwell. I was the man who had built a massive infrastructure empire with nothing but bare hands and ruthless determination. I was the man who had crushed corporate rivals, navigated vicious economic storms, and forged a legacy out of solid steel and concrete. My son and his greedy wife had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had assumed my age made me weak. They had assumed my grief over losing Patricia made me a permanent, easy target. They wanted a frail, broken victim who would quietly sign away his life and rot in a state-run facility without putting up a single fight. But by trying to artificially destroy my mind, they had inadvertently awakened the very instincts that had made me a titan in the business world. The sorrow that had paralyzed me for days was completely gone. The desperate hope that my son actually loved me had been burned away to absolute ash. There was nothing left inside me now but a cold, calculating, and predatory focus. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of my shirt, feeling the familiar, powerful rhythm of my heart beating steadily in my chest. I was completely lucid. I was entirely aware of every single piece on the grand chessboard they had set up. They thought they were the grandmasters manipulating a blind pawn. They had absolutely no idea that the board belonged to me, and I was about to flip it over completely. I walked over to the window and looked out at the sprawling, magnificent estate that I had built with my own blood and sweat. This was my sanctuary. This was the legacy I had created for my family, and no one, absolutely no one, was going to steal it from me. I needed to gather my troops and secure the concrete evidence that would lock them away for a very long time. I knew exactly who to call, and I knew exactly how to spring a flawless trap. I turned away from the window, a cold, ruthless smile spreading across my face. The time for weeping was officially over. It was time for war. I moved with a quiet, deliberate precision that I had not felt in years. I stripped off the pajamas that were damp with the cold sweat of the poison and dressed in a simple pair of dark slacks and a heavy wool sweater. I reached under the heavy wooden bed frame and retrieved the stainless steel thermos. The pale green liquid inside sloshed softly, a heavy metallic sound that perfectly matched the coldness in my chest. I slipped the thermos into a worn leather satchel. I cracked the bedroom door open and listened. The sprawling house was completely silent. Derek and Monica were not early risers. They preferred to sleep until the mid-morning sun warmed the estate, leaving the early hours entirely to me. I crept down the back staircase, avoiding the main hall where the floorboards sometimes creaked. I bypassed the grand kitchen and went straight out through the mudroom door. The freezing mountain air bit at my cheeks, but it felt incredibly refreshing. It felt like freedom. The gravel crunched softly beneath my heavy leather boots as I walked. I walked past the main garage where Derek had parked his gleaming leased luxury sport utility vehicle and headed for the old detached carriage house. Inside sat my vintage pickup truck. It was an old reliable machine that I had meticulously restored years ago. I did not turn on the headlights until I was a mile down the winding access road ensuring the roar of the engine was completely swallowed by the dense pine forest. I was finally off the estate. The drive down into the sprawling city of Denver took just over an hour, as the winding mountain roads flattened out into wide highways. The bustling energy of the city slowly surrounded me. I navigated through the morning traffic with absolute unwavering focus. The towering glass skyscrapers reflected the bright sunlight. I was not heading to a regular hospital or a public clinic. If I went through standard medical channels, the results would be logged into a central database. Derek could easily gain access to those records if he managed to secure my medical power of attorney. I needed absolute secrecy. I drove to a private independent toxicology laboratory located in a quiet commercial district on the outskirts of the city. I had used this facility decades ago to run discreet background drug screenings on potential high-level corporate partners. I walked through the glass doors and approached the front desk. I did not give them my real name. I paid $3,000 in crisp, untraceable cash. I handed the heavy stainless steel thermos to the head technician, a serious-looking man in a pristine white coat. I looked him directly in the eyes and told him I needed a comprehensive, expedited chemical analysis of the liquid inside. I told him I needed to know exactly what kind of synthetic toxins, heavy sedatives, or antipsychotic compounds were hiding in that green sludge. He nodded slowly, recognizing the intense urgency in my voice. He promised me that the preliminary results would be ready within 48 hours. I thanked him, turned on my heel, and walked back out into the cold morning air. The physical evidence was finally secure. Now I needed to assemble my army. I needed men who would fight alongside me. I drove to a massive, crowded electronics store on the other side of the city. I walked straight to the back aisles and purchased a cheap, prepaid cellular phone with cash. I activated it sitting in the driver's seat of my old truck, staring out at the busy, sprawling parking lot. I dialed a number I had memorized more than 30 years ago. It was the direct private line of Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan was not just a lawyer. He was a brilliant, ruthless legal shark who had helped me build my infrastructure empire from the very beginning. He was also my oldest and most trusted friend. The phone rang twice before he answered. His deep, gravelly voice filled the tiny cabin of my truck. I did not waste any time with pleasantries. "Jonathan, it is Harrison," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "I am calling you from an untraceable phone. I need you to drop whatever you are doing and listen to me very carefully." Jonathan was a man who never panicked, but the sudden severity in my tone immediately caught his absolute attention. He asked me what was wrong. I took a deep breath and told him absolutely everything. I told him about the fake bankruptcy. I told him about Derek celebrating my downfall with that sickening smile. I told him about the poison, the shadow buyer, and the terrifying plan to throw me into a state-run mental ward. For a long moment, there was absolutely no sound on the other end of the line. When Jonathan finally spoke, his voice was trembling with a dark, simmering rage. He asked me what I needed him to do. I told him to prepare for absolute war. I needed him to start looking quietly into Derek and his private holding company. I needed to know exactly what legal maneuvers my son to execute behind my back. Jonathan swore to me that he would lock down my real assets tighter than a federal vault. Then I hung up and dialed the second number. This one belonged to Martin Reed. Martin was a former federal investigator who now operated as an independent private detective. I was a man who lived in the deep shadows, a man who possessed a terrifying ability to unearth the darkest, most buried secrets of anyone on Earth. When he answered, his tone was completely flat and professional. "Martin, I need your specific set of skills immediately," I said, gripping the cheap plastic steering wheel so tightly my joints physically ached. "I need you to dig into everything my son Derek Caldwell has touched in the last 5 years. I need you to completely tear his life apart. Follow the money trail. Track his offshore accounts, his business failures, and his social connections. Do not leave a single stone unturned. I overheard him talking about a $12 million debt to a cartel syndicate. I want to know exactly who those men are. I want names, locations, and leverage. I want to know exactly who he owes his miserable life to. Martin did not ask a single unnecessary question. He was an incredibly efficient, ruthless professional who immediately understood the absolute gravity of my demands. He simply told me he would have a preliminary dossier ready within 2 days. I ended the call and tossed the burner phone into the passenger seat. My chest heaved with a deep, cleansing breath. The pieces were officially in motion. My son thought he was trapping a frail old man in a web of lies and chemical fog. He had absolutely no idea that he had just stepped into the jaws of a predator. I put the truck into gear and began the long drive back up the mountain. I had to return to the Grand Estate before Derek and Monica woke up. I had to go back to being their frail, helpless victim for just a little while longer. But the clock was ticking down, and their flawless nightmare was finally coming to a violent end. I navigated the heavy morning traffic of the Denver suburbs, my mind processing the sheer magnitude of what I was about to do. I needed eyes and ears inside my own home. I needed to capture their vile intentions on audio, not just to build an airtight legal case, but to harden my own breaking heart against any lingering paternal weakness. I drove to a specialized electronics retailer hidden inside a massive, nondescript strip mall. It was the kind of place that catered to private security firms and paranoid tech enthusiasts. I parked my vintage truck near the back of the lot and walked inside, pulling my heavy wool sweater tight against the winter chill. The store was quiet, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. I approached a glass counter displaying rows of high-end surveillance equipment. I did not ask for a basic baby monitor or a cheap commercial microphone. I asked the clerk for military-grade voice-activated micro-recorders. I needed devices with extended battery life, noise-canceling filters, and secure digital storage that could easily transmit audio to a remote server. The clerk handed me 3 tiny matte black squares, each no larger than a common postage stamp. I paid him $3,000 in untraceable cash, tucked the devices deep into my coat pocket, and walked out. The drive back up the mountain was agonizingly long. Every mile that passed felt like an eternity. I had to beat my son and his treacherous wife to the punch. I had to infiltrate their private sanctuary before they even realized I was awake. I pulled my truck back into the old carriage house, turned off the heavy engine, and let the absolute silence of the mountain morning wash over me. I checked my gold wristwatch. It was just past 8 in this morning. Derek and Monica would likely sleep for another hour, recovering from the exhausting effort of planning my ultimate demise. I stepped out of the truck and walked across the frosted gravel, slipping through the heavy mudroom door with the silent, practiced grace of a man half my age. The Grand Estate was still wrapped in a deep, quiet slumber. I crept down the long hallway toward the east wing, where the luxurious guest suites were located. My heart hammered a steady, rhythmic warning against my ribs, but my hands were completely still. I reached the heavy oak door of their bedroom and paused, pressing my ear against the cool wood. I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of their breathing. I slowly turned the brass handle, pushing the door open just enough to slip my body inside. The room was dark, the heavy blackout curtains pulled tightly shut against the bright morning sun. Derek was sprawled across the massive king-sized bed, snoring softly, his face buried deep in the expensive down pillows. Monica was curled up beside him, her breathing shallow and even. Looking at my son, sleeping so peacefully in the house, I had built for him, a fresh wave of bitter sorrow washed over me. This was the boy I had carried on my shoulders. This was the man who wanted me to rot in a sterile cell. I swallowed the lump in my throat and dropped down to my hands and knees. The thick, plush carpet muffled my movements entirely. I crawled toward the edge of the bed, moving with agonizing slowness. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the first micro recorder. I peeled the protective backing off the industrial adhesive and pressed the tiny black square hard against the wooden slates directly underneath their mattress. I held it there for 10 seconds, making absolutely sure it was perfectly secure. The device was entirely invisible in the deep shadows of the bed frame. It would capture every single whisper, every cruel joke, and every sinister plan they hatched in the supposed safety of the dark. I slowly backed away from the bed, stood up and slipped out of the room, pulling the door shut with a soft, inaudible click. My next target was the massive garage. I walked swiftly across the courtyard, my breath forming pale clouds in the freezing air. Derek had parked his pristine leased luxury sport utility vehicle right in the center of the heated garage. I approached the driver's side door. It was unlocked. Derek was incredibly arrogant. He believed he was completely untouchable in his father's house. I opened the heavy door and slid into the expensive leather driver's seat. The car smelled like expensive cologne and pure entitlement. I took the second micro recorder from my pocket and reached deep underneath the steering column. I navigated through the complex wiring harness until I found a smooth, hidden metal bracket. I pressed the adhesive backing firmly against the cold steel, securing the bug right next to the primary microphone of his hands, free calling system. Every phone call he made, every conversation he had with his cartel handlers while driving down the mountain would now be transmitted directly to my secure server. I wiped my fingerprints off the smooth leather steering wheel, stepped out of the vehicle, and gently pushed the heavy door completely closed. The physical exertion of the morning was beginning to take a very real toll on my 70-year-old body. My muscles ached, and a dull, throbbing pain radiated through my lower back, but the mission was a complete success. I had successfully bugged my own estate. I had surrounded my enemies with invisible ears. I walked back into the main house and headed straight for my private study. I needed to reset the stage. I walked over to my heavy leather armchair by the grand unlit fireplace and sat down heavily. I let out a long, exhausted breath. I reached over to the small side table and deliberately knocked over a stack of old books, scattering them across the hardwood floor. I wanted the room to look like the chaotic domain of a confused, failing mind. I slouched forward in the chair, letting my chin drop toward my chest. I messed up my gray hair, making it look wild and unkempt. I let my hands rest limply on my lap, practicing the violent, chemical tremors I had suffered through the previous morning. I sat there, in the quiet gloom of the study, staring blankly at the cold ashes in the fireplace, waiting for the performance to begin. I did not have to wait very long. About 20 minutes later, I heard the heavy footsteps of my son walking down the grand staircase. The sound of his expensive leather shoes clicking against the hardwood floor echoed loudly through the silent house. I heard the sharp, high-pitched voice of Monica complaining about the cold temperature in the hallway. They were awake and they were hunting. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, burying the sharp, capable businessman deep inside my soul, and resurrected the broken, pathetic old man they wanted to see. The heavy oak doors of my study swung open. Derek stepped inside. I hung my head low. The invisible trap was perfectly set for them. I sat slouched in my heavy leather armchair, letting my jaw hang slightly slack. The performance was becoming second nature. Derek walked into the study a few minutes later, holding a pristine leather folder. He barely looked at me, tossing the folder onto my mahogany desk with a dismissive thud. "These are the preliminary transfer deeds." "Dad," he announced, his voice devoid of any real warmth. "I just need your signature on a few primary documents to get the escrow process started with my investor friend. We will do the final signing on Friday. You do not even need to read them. I have highlighted the signature lines to make it incredibly easy for you." I offered a weak, trembling nod. I did not reach for the pen. I just stared at the floor, playing the perfectly broken victim. Monica stood in the doorway, scrolling on her phone, looking profoundly bored. "Just let him rest, Derek," she sighed, not even bothering to look up from her bright screen. He looks completely out of it today. The medication must really be taking a toll on his system. She used the word medication so casually, as if she were administering a simple daily vitamin. Derek grunted in agreement and led her out of the room, leaving the heavy oak doors wide open. As soon as their footsteps faded down the long hallway, I felt a sharp, persistent vibration deep inside the pocket of my wool sweater. It was the burner phone. I waited 5 minutes, ensuring the house was still before I stood up. I walked to the doors and pushed them shut, engaging the lock with a silent click. I pulled the phone from my pocket. It was a text from the laboratory in Denver. The results were ready. I dialed the number they provided. The head technician answered on the first ring, his voice grim and clinical. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "I ran the chemical analysis on the liquid 3 separate times to be certain. The liquid is heavily laced with a synthetic compound called haloperidol." I asked him what it was. He let out a heavy sigh. "It is a potent first-generation antipsychotic medication," he explained. "It is strictly used in psychiatric wards to treat severe schizophrenia. It is incredibly dangerous. If administered to a healthy elderly patient, especially in massive doses, it completely mimics the advanced stages of severe dementia. It causes violent muscle tremors, profound cognitive paralysis, memory loss, and absolute emotional apathy. It traps the patient inside their own failing body. If you continued drinking this for another week, the neurological damage could become completely irreversible." My blood ran cold. Hearing the medical reality out loud was different than suspecting it. My own son and daughter-in-law were actively, methodically attempting to destroy my brain. They were committing a slow, calculated murder of my mind just so they could steal my land without a fight. I thanked the technician and ended the call. Before I could even begin to process the horrifying weight of the medical report, the small burner phone vibrated again. This time it was a call from Martin Reed, the private investigator I had hired just yesterday. I pressed the phone tightly to my ear. "Martin, tell me what you have found," I demanded, pacing the length of my locked study. The seasoned investigator did not waste a single second with pleasantries. "Your son is a dead man," Harrison Martin said, his tone utterly flat and devoid of any emotion. I spent the last 24 hours digging through his encrypted financial records, his travel logs, and his private communications. Derek does not have a single legitimate investment portfolio. He has spent the last 5 years feeding a massive, uncontrollable gambling addiction. He has been flying to Las Vegas under an assumed name twice a month, playing high-stakes underground sports betting tables. He thought he was smarter than the house. He was wrong. The numbers Martin began to rattle off were absolutely staggering. Derek had blown through every single dollar he had ever earned. He had secretly drained his own retirement accounts. He had leveraged his luxury home to the absolute brink of foreclosure. But the worst part was who he had borrowed from to chase his devastating losses. "He owes $12 million, Harrison Martin," continued the grim reality, settling heavily over the line. "And he does not owe it to a bank. He owes it to a violent, deeply entrenched illegal gambling syndicate operating out of the Nevada desert. These men do not send polite collection letters. They send ruthless enforcers." I intercepted a series of encrypted messages sent to Derek's primary cell phone just 3 days ago. They told him that if he did not produce the $12 million by the end of this month, they were going to brutally murder his wife, and then they were going to take their absolute time dismantling him. I stopped pacing. The heavy silence of the grand study seemed to close in around me. Suddenly, every single piece of the dark, twisted puzzle snapped into perfect, horrifying alignment. Derek was not just a greedy son looking to accelerate his inheritance. He was a terrified, cornered animal. He had brought the absolute worst kind of danger directly to my doorstep. He had looked at the violent, impending threat to his own life, and he had made a conscious, deliberate choice to sacrifice his own father to save his own skin. He had invited the cartel onto my sacred property. He had authorized them to survey my land. He was going to sell my legacy for pennies on the dollar pocket, the remaining millions from the Zenith Corporation deal, and vanish into the wind while I rotted in a state-run asylum. The sheer scale of his cowardice was breathtaking. I thanked Martin for his exceptional work and instructed him to send the entire encrypted dossier to Jonathan Pierce immediately. I ended the call and slipped the burner phone back into my pocket. The betrayal was complete, but my counterattack was just beginning to take shape. I walked over to the grand mahogany desk, where Derek had carelessly tossed the preliminary transfer deeds. I stared at the bright yellow highlighted signature lines, feeling a dark, powerful, unstoppable resolve wash over me. My arrogant son had completely underestimated the man who raised him. He thought his $12 million problem gave him the right to destroy my entire existence. He believed the violent syndicate in Las Vegas was the most terrifying force he could ever face. I was gravely mistaken. The most dangerous force in his life was not a nameless cartel enforcer. It was a heartbroken 70-year-old father who had absolutely nothing left to lose. I carefully organized the documents on the desk, ensuring they looked completely untouched. I unlocked the heavy oak doors of the study and sat back down in my leather armchair, perfectly ready to play my part. The pieces were all on the board, and the final moves were entirely mine to make today. I would definitely not fail this time. The pieces were all on the board, and the final moves were entirely mine to make today. I would definitely not fail this time. The rest of the day crawled by at an agonizingly slow pace. I maintained my facade of a broken, sedated old man through dinner, allowing Monica to guide me to my bedroom. I accepted her nightly poisoned smoothie with trembling hands, repeating my routine of spitting it into a hidden container the moment she closed the door. I waited patiently in the dark until the massive house settled into a deep, undisturbed silence. When the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times, signaling the dead of night, I slipped out of my bed. I walked silently down the grand staircase and entered my study. I locked the heavy oak doors behind me and pulled the thick curtains tightly shut, ensuring no light could escape. I turned on a small desk lamp and reached into my leather satchel. I pulled out the receiver connected to the military-grade micro-recorders I had planted earlier that morning. I plugged in a pair of simple black headphones and placed them over my ears. My hands were perfectly steady. I took a deep breath, steeling my heart for what I was about to hear, and pressed the playback button for the audio feed coming from the guest bedroom. The recording started with a low, staticky hiss, followed by the faint rustling of heavy blankets. Then Monica spoke. Her voice was crystal clear, cutting through the silence of my study like a jagged piece of broken glass. She sounded profoundly annoyed. "I do not understand how he is still walking around," she complained, her tone dripping with venom and frustration. "He was standing on the driveway this morning arguing with you about those men. The dosage I am giving him should have him completely bedridden by now. It is exhausting having to hover over him all day. I hate looking at his vacant eyes. He is like a stubborn old ghost haunting this house." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach as I listened to her casual cruelty. She spoke about me as if I were a pest, a minor inconvenience that needed to be exterminated. I heard the sound of a heavy sigh from the other side of the room. It was Derek. He sounded incredibly tired, but not tired from a hard day of honest work. He sounded tired from the stress of orchestrating a massive illegal fraud to save his own miserable life from the ruthless gambling syndicate holding his massive debts. "Just keep upping the dosage," Monica. Derek replied, his voice laced with absolute coldness. "Stop worrying about how he looks. We just need him compliant and docile for another 48 hours. Once he signs the transfer deed on Friday morning, none of this will matter anymore." I heard the sound of shifting pillows, followed by Derek continuing his horrifying monologue. "I have everything perfectly lined up. As soon as the ink is dry and the property is legally in my holding company, the doctor will arrive. I already paid him $50,000 in cash. He will examine my father and officially declare him legally incompetent due to rapid onset dementia brought on by severe financial stress. It is an airtight medical evaluation. I will secure the full power of attorney by Monday morning. Monica let out a soft, satisfied hum, and then what she asked eagerly. Then Derek sneered, his voice dropping into a register of pure malice. We are going to dump him in the state ward downtown, the one on 5th Street. It is underfunded, understaffed, and completely isolated. I have already filled out the preliminary admission forms. We will drop him off, pay the first month in advance, and wash our hands of him completely. By the time the heavy sedatives completely fry his brain, he will not even know where he is. He will not even remember his own name by Christmas. I hit the pause button on the receiver. The sudden silence in my study was deafening. I slowly pulled the headphones off my ears and set them down on the smooth mahogany desk. I stared blankly at the flickering embers in the cold fireplace. For a long time I did not move. I did not breathe. The sheer, unadulterated evil of his words echoed loudly inside my skull. He will not even remember his own name by Christmas. The sentence repeated over and over, striking my heart like a physical hammer. The heavy dam finally broke. I leaned forward, buried my face in my hands, and wept. I did not just cry. I sobbed with a raw, agonizing intensity that shook my entire body. I wept for the innocent little boy who used to sit on my lap and point at the bright stars. I wept for the teenager who used to ask me for advice on how to tie a necktie before his high school dances. I wept for the man I thought I had raised, a man who had somehow morphed into a heartless, calculating monster willing to discard his own father like a piece of rotten trash just to save his own skin. I cried until my eyes burned and my throat felt completely raw. I let out all the heavy grief, all the crushing paternal guilt, and all the devastating sorrow of losing my only child. And then, as quickly as the violent emotional storm had come, it completely stopped. The hot tears dried up. The desperate, aching love I had carried in my heart for 35 years was violently severed, replaced by something dark, heavy, and absolutely unyielding. I lifted my head from my trembling hands. I wiped my wet face with a harsh, rigid finality. My broken heart was no longer breaking. It was rapidly turning into a block of solid, impenetrable ice. I looked down at the small audio receiver resting quietly on my desk. The audio evidence was irrefutable. The war had been officially declared in the deep shadows of my own home, and there was absolutely no turning back now. I reached for the cheap burner phone tucked safely inside the pocket of my sweater. It was time to initiate the final, devastating phase of my master counterattack. I had heard more than enough. Now it was time to make absolutely sure that they would be the ones who would never forget the brutal consequences of their actions. I was going to legally and methodically strip away everything they loved, everything they valued, and everything they foolishly thought they had secured. They wanted to steal my entire life and lock me away in a dark room. I was going to permanently destroy theirs. I sat straight up in my large leather chair, staring fiercely into the dark, silent room, my mind completely focused on the absolute, magnificent ruin I was about to unleash upon them. I was ready to bring their world crashing down entirely without a single ounce of mercy. The trap was finally fully set and waiting for them to step inside tomorrow. The morning sun brought a cold light to the mountains as I prepared for the most important meeting of my life. I left the estate long before Derek and Monica stirred. I drove my vintage truck down the winding roads, bypassing the busy downtown center of Denver entirely. I headed toward an industrial district on the eastern edge of the city. Jonathan Pierce was waiting for me inside a massive repurposed brick warehouse. It was a secure private property owned by one of my anonymous shell companies. When I pushed open the heavy steel door, the cavernous space echoed with my footsteps. Jonathan stood by a long wooden table, his briefcase open, his face lined with unshakable concern. He had spent the night reviewing the financial dossier that Martin Reed compiled. He looked up, his eyes filled with profound sorrow and simmering anger. "Harrison," he said, dropping his voice into a steady timbre. "I read the files. I saw the massive debts. I know exactly what your son is planning. It is worse than we could have imagined." I pulled out a heavy metal chair and sat down. "I know, Jonathan," I replied, perfectly calm. "I heard it directly from his own mouth last night. I planted audio bugs in their bedroom. They are planning to declare me mentally incompetent and lock me away in a state asylum by Monday morning." Jonathan closed his eyes, letting out a heavy breath. He shook his head slowly, struggling to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. "What do we do?" he asked, looking back at me with absolute loyalty. "Do we call the federal authorities right now? Do we have him arrested for attempted fraud?" I looked at my oldest friend and slowly shook my head. "No," I said softly. "Involving the police right now would only send him to prison. That is entirely too easy for him. He wants to play a ruthless game of corporate warfare, and I am going to show him how a true titan plays the board. I need you to execute a massive, completely invisible financial maneuver by the end of the day." Jonathan leaned forward, pulling a legal pad and a silver pen from his briefcase. "I am listening," he murmured. I took a deep breath, preparing to reveal a massive, closely guarded secret that I had kept hidden from everyone for more than 10 years. "You saw the name of the company that Derek is desperately trying to sell my estate to," I began. "Zenith Corporation," he confirmed. "They are a massive commercial real estate conglomerate. They have been trying to acquire your specific mountain ridge for an enormous Western distribution hub. Derek thinks he is going to flip your land to them for $40 million, pay off his cartel debts, and walk away wealthy." I let a cold, calculated smile spread slowly across my face. "Yes, he does," I replied, my tone dropping into a deadly whisper. "But there is a critical piece of information that my arrogant son does not know. Zenith Corporation is a subsidiary of the much larger global holding group based in the Cayman Islands." I paused, letting the silence hang in the wide, empty warehouse. "And I am the silent majority shareholder of that parent company." Jonathan stopped writing instantly. The silver pen hovered completely frozen over the yellow paper. He stared at me, his eyes widening, as the absolute brilliance of the situation finally washed over him. "You own Zenith," he breathed out, stunned. "He is trying to sell your own land back to your own company." I nodded, feeling the immense crushing power of my hidden empire. "Exactly," I said. "He thinks he has secured a perfect anonymous buyer who will save his miserable life. He has absolutely no idea that I am the man pulling the strings from the very top." Jonathan let out a sharp, breathless laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "Harrison, that is incredible. We can block the sale entirely, and he will be left with nothing but his massive debts. He will be completely ruined." I leaned closer to the table, locking my eyes onto his. "I do not just want him ruined, Jonathan," I stated with terrifying clarity. "I want him entirely owned. I want him to feel the exact same level of profound, suffocating helplessness that he tried to force upon me. I want you to look into the $12 million debt he owes to that violent gambling syndicate in Las Vegas." Jonathan frowned, confusion wrinkling his forehead. "The syndicate debt?" he asked carefully. "Why would we touch that?" "Those are incredibly dangerous men, Harrison. We do not want to cross paths with a ruthless cartel." "We are not going to cross paths with them," I explained smoothly, outlining the final phase of my master plan. "We are going to buy them out completely. I want you to set up an untraceable shell company by noon today. Funnel $15 million of my private capital into that account. I want you to reach out to the heads of that syndicate through your most secure underground legal channels. Offer to purchase Derek's entire debt portfolio for the full $12 million, plus a generous $3 million premium for their immediate cooperation and absolute silence. Criminals of that caliber do not care about personal vendettas, Jonathan. They only care about clean, untraceable cash. If we offer them a massive profit to simply walk away and transfer the debt ledger to our anonymous company, they will take the deal without a single hesitation. Jonathan stared at me for a very long time, absorbing the terrifying genius of the trap. You want to buy his life, he whispered, awe mixing with fear in his deep voice. You want to become his sole creditor. I nodded slowly, feeling the icy resolve solidify in my chest. Yes, I said. By Friday morning, when he thinks he is signing the final transfer deed to save himself, he will actually be signing his entire existence over to me. The syndicate will be completely out of the picture. The violent threats against his life will vanish, but his $12 million debt will remain entirely intact, legally transferred to a holding company that I control absolutely. He will owe me everything, and I will not show him a single ounce of mercy. I will completely dismantle his fraudulent business. I will strip him of his luxury cars, his pristine house, and every single cent he thinks he has hidden away. Jonathan promised the anonymous shell company would be fully established within the hour, and the syndicate buyout completed by nightfall. He nodded firmly, packing his notes away. I walked out of the cold warehouse and stepped back into the bright morning sunlight. The crisp, biting air filled my tired lungs, giving me a sudden burst of renewed energy. My son arrogantly thought he was walking straight into a massive life-saving fortune. He was actually walking blindly into an unbreakable steel cage. I climbed into my truck and drove home, perfectly ready to play the fragile victim today. His absolute destruction was now fully legally guaranteed. I parked my vintage truck back in the old carriage house and quietly made my way across the frosted gravel toward the main estate. The cold mountain air stung my lungs, but it was a bracing reminder of the power I now held. I slipped through the mudroom door and carefully navigated the back staircase, returning to my master bedroom before the house fully awakened. I stripped off my street clothes, put on my wrinkled pajamas, and climbed back into the heavy bed. It was time to fully embrace the role of the dying, confused old man. I let my shoulders slump permanently forward. I practiced the vacant, lost stare in the tall vanity mirror, forcing all the intelligence out of my eyes. I forced my hands to adopt a subtle, continuous tremor that would look entirely natural. When I finally shuffled down the grand staircase later that morning, dragging my feet heavily against the polished hardwood steps, I saw Derek and Monica sitting in the formal living room. They looked up as I entered the wide space. I deliberately stumbled slightly, catching myself heavily against the thick wooden doorframe. Derek immediately stood up, but there was no rush of genuine concern in his movements. He walked over to me with a slow, exaggerated patience, taking me firmly by the elbow. He guided me to my leather armchair, as if I were a fragile piece of glass that had completely outlived its usefulness. He did not ask how I slept. He did not ask if I was hungry. He deposited me into the chair and walked away. The days leading up to the Friday signing dissolved into a sickening routine of manufactured helplessness. I spent most of my time staring blankly at the unlit fireplace, speaking only in short, heavily confused sentences. Monica took absolute delight in her role as my warden. Every evening, precisely as the sun dipped behind the jagged mountain peaks, she would march into my study, carrying that tall, frosted glass of pale green poison. She no longer bothered with the sweet, overly affectionate tone she had used on the very first day. Her patience was completely gone, replaced by a raw, unfiltered irritation. She would shove the cold glass into my trembling hands and stand directly over me, tapping her manicured fingers aggressively against her folded arms. "Drink it, Harrison," she would snap, her voice hard and commanding in the quiet room. "You need to sleep, and I need a break from watching you wander around this house like a lost ghost." I would raise the heavy glass to my lips, letting my hands shake violently to sell the illusion. I would take a small, careful sip, letting the bitter, metallic-tasting liquid pool in the back of my mouth, and then pretend to swallow deeply. as soon as she turned her back to check the notifications on her glowing phone screen. I would spit the toxic sludge into the thick linen towel I kept tucked discreetly in my lap. Once I was safely alone behind the locked door of my bedroom, the rest of the poisoned smoothie went straight into the hidden stainless steel thermos under my bed. I remained completely lucid, completely sharp, but they firmly thought my brain was melting away into absolute nothingness. Derek grew increasingly bold and careless as the week slowly progressed. He completely stopped pretending to be the supportive, rescuing son. He treated me like a frustrating obstacle that simply needed to be managed until the legal paperwork was finalized. He would walk briskly into my study with thick stacks of legal documents, aggressively pointing at the yellow highlighted lines where my signature was required. He would stand closely over my chair, gripping my shoulder entirely too tight, his fingers digging painfully into my collarbone to establish physical dominance. "You are going to sign these on Friday morning, Dad," he would say slowly, enunciating every single word as if he were speaking to a slow child. "Do not forget our arrangement. The investor is coming here to the house and we are going to save you from your massive debt. You just need to hold a pen and write your name exactly where I tell you to." I would look up at him with wide, watery eyes, nodding my head weakly in submission. "I am so tired, Derek." I would whisper, my voice cracking perfectly under the feigned weight of exhaustion. "I just want this terrible nightmare to be over, so I can finally rest in peace." He would smile, that same cold, predatory smile I had seen at the dinner table. "It will be over very soon, Dad. Just do exactly what I tell you to do and do not cause any problems." His arrogance was absolutely blinding. He believed his master plan was entirely flawless. He had absolutely no idea that the financial trap closing tightly around his own neck was made of unbreakable steel. By Thursday afternoon, their confidence reached a terrifying, nauseating peak. They no longer bothered to leave the room or lower their voices when they wanted to discuss my bleak future. They stood mere feet away from my armchair, talking about me as if I were already completely deaf or entirely brain dead. I sat slumped deeply in my chair, staring blankly at the intricately patterned rug on the floor, while they casually planned my permanent exile. "I cannot wait to get him out of this house," Monica complained loudly, pouring herself a large glass of red wine at the wet bar. "The smell of old age and sickness is seeping into the expensive furniture. I am having professional decorators come in on Monday morning to completely gut this entire room." Derek chuckled softly, flipping lazily through his phone messages. "You only have to endure his pathetic wandering for one more night," he replied smoothly. "The private doctor is officially confirmed for Friday afternoon. As soon as the transfer deed is securely registered in my holding company, the medical evaluation happens right here in this room. By Saturday morning, he will be securely locked in the state ward downtown, eating pureed food and staring at a blank cinder block wall for the rest of his miserable life. He will not even recognize us if we ever decide to visit, which we obviously will not do." I sat perfectly still, absorbing every single insult, every cruel laugh, and every heartless remark. I memorized the exact cadence of their voices. I memorized the sheer joy they took in my supposed destruction. They thought they were looking at a shattered, fading old man who had simply given up the will to live. They did not realize they were looking at a silent, heavily armed predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The intense hatred in my chest hardened into absolute, unshakable concrete. Let them mock me openly. Let them enjoy their final hours of stolen comfort and false superiority. The sun was rapidly setting on their arrogant paradise. Friday morning was coming fast, and I was going to deliver a reckoning, so absolute, so profoundly devastating, that they would remember my name with pure terror forever. Friday morning broke with heavy gray clouds over the mountains. I sat in my leather armchair, behind the mahogany desk in my study, long before I heard their footsteps. I let my posture collapse inward, rounding my shoulders and letting my chin rest against my chest. My heart beat with a slow, powerful rhythm. The heavy desk drawer was unlocked, hiding the toxicology report, and the financial dossier. I took one deep breath, letting the sharp businessman vanish beneath the hollow shell they wanted to see. At precisely 9, the oak doors swung open. Derek walked in first, dressed in a navy suit, radiating absolute victory. Monica followed closely behind him, rigid with impatient anticipation. They did not come alone. Two strangers stepped into my sanctuary. The first man was sweating nervously, clutching a cheap leather briefcase. He had the shifty demeanor of a corrupt notary. The second stranger was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a dark suit. His eyes were cold, flat, and dead. He looked exactly like a man who collected brutal debts. Derek walked directly to my desk. "Good morning, Dad," he said smoothly, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "I brought my investor friend to finalize the paperwork. This is the representative, and this is the public notary who will witness the transfer." The tall man gave me a slow, predatory nod. He was the syndicate enforcer here to ensure his cartel secured the property deed covering my son's gambling debt. He looked at me with pure contempt, seeing a pathetic obstacle standing between him and his payout. I raised my head slowly, forcing my eyes to look wide, watery, and lost. "Hello," I whispered, my voice incredibly frail and raspy. "I am so terribly tired today, Derek. Can we please make this quick?" Derek offered a warm, flawless smile. "Of course, Dad," he replied softly. "We are going to make this very quick. You will be able to rest properly in a few minutes." He opened the leather folder and began spreading the thick legal documents across the smooth wood. The papers were heavy and official, filled with dense legal jargon designed to sign away my home, my land, and my entire life. Derek pointed a manicured finger at the bright yellow highlighted lines at the bottom of the final page. He leaned in close, placing his hand heavily on my shoulder. "I want you to take a deep breath, Dad," Derek murmured gently. "I know losing everything is hard to accept, but you are doing the right thing. You just need to sign right here on this line, and then sign the secondary page to finalize the transfer of the deed. Just sign here, Dad. It will all be over soon. I am saving you." Monica stepped up beside him, folding her arms tightly across her chest. She looked down at me with a cold, triumphant smirk. "We are going to take such good care of you, Harrison," she added, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You just need to focus on signing your name." I looked down at the thick stack of papers. Derek reached into his pocket and pulled out a solid gold fountain pen. He gently pressed the cool metal barrel into my right hand. I let my fingers wrap awkwardly around it. I commanded my muscles to react, forcing my entire hand to shake violently. The gold pen rattled against the polished mahogany desk, making a rapid, pathetic clicking sound. I let the tremor travel up my arm, making my shoulders shake. I looked up at the four people surrounding my desk. The corrupt notary was looking away, clearly uncomfortable. The syndicate enforcer was watching the pen with hungry, impatient eyes. Monica was visibly annoyed by my shaking, and my son was staring at me with absolute, unapologetic greed. The silence in the grand study stretched out for 10 long, agonizing seconds. I absorbed the reality of the moment. I felt the final lingering thread of my paternal love wither and turn to ash. Then the performance officially ended. My hand stopped shaking entirely. The sudden absolute stillness in my arm was so jarring that Derek actually flinched, his hand dropping away from my shoulder. I slowly sat up, straightening my spine against the tall back of the leather armchair. The slumped, defeated posture completely vanished. I lifted my head and let the sharp, ruthless clarity return fully to my eyes. I stared dead into Derek's face, watching the confusion begin to cloud his confident features. I opened my fingers and let the heavy gold pen drop onto the hard wooden desk. It landed with a sharp crack. I turned my gaze away from my son and looked directly at his wife. My voice was no longer a frail, raspy whisper. It was deep, steady, and resonated with an icy, terrifying authority. "The haloperidol really leaves a bitter aftertaste, Monica," I stated calmly, locking my eyes onto hers. You should have used a lot more sugar in those smoothies. The artificial sweetness on Monica's face melted away instantly, replaced by a mask of sheer unadulterated horror. She took a sudden panicked step backward, her mouth falling open in a silent gasp. Derek froze completely. His confident posture shattered as his brain desperately tried to process the impossible words I had just spoken. The color drained rapidly from his face, leaving his skin pale. "What did you just say?" Derek whispered, his voice trembling with a sudden, overwhelming dread. I slowly reached down and gripped the brass handle of my desk drawer. I pulled it open with a smooth, deliberate motion. "I am saying that your amateur attempt at chemical lobotomy was a complete failure." "Derek," I replied, pulling the thick stack of evidence from the drawer and dropping it heavily onto the transfer deeds. "I know exactly what you put in my drink. I know exactly how much money you owe to the violent men in Las Vegas. And I know exactly what you plan to do to me." The syndicate enforcer, standing near the door, suddenly tensed his hand, moving instinctively toward the inside of his dark suit jacket. He realized instantly that the situation had violently unraveled. The sleazy notary dropped his cheap briefcase on the floor, his hands shaking wildly as he backed away toward the wall. "You are not a savior." "Derek," I continued, my voice echoing powerfully through the room. "You are a terrified, cornered coward who brought a cartel to my front door because you could not control your own addictions. You thought you were looking at a broken, clueless old man who would blindly sign his life away to save you. You were completely wrong." I stood up from my leather chair. I towered over the desk. Derek was visibly trembling now, his eyes darting frantically between my face and the heavy toxicology report resting on the table. The trap had been perfectly sprung. The steel doors were about to slam shut on his entire life. The steel doors were about to slam shut on his entire life. Derek stood completely paralyzed, his jaw working silently as his brain short-circuited under the crushing weight of my words. Monica let out a high, thin gasp, instinctively backing away until her shoulders hit the tall wooden bookshelves. Her hands flew to her mouth, covering a scream of pure, absolute terror. I reached into the open drawer and pulled out the thick stack of papers I had meticulously prepared. I tossed them onto the center of the mahogany desk. They landed with a heavy, definitive thud, scattering directly over the fraudulent transfer deeds. I pointed a steady finger at the top document. "That is a certified toxicology report from an independent laboratory in Denver." I stated, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "It details the exact chemical composition of the green sludge you tried to force down my throat every single night. I know you researched how to manufacture dementia, Monica. I know you thought you were incredibly clever. Right beneath that report are 70 pages of transcribed audio recordings captured directly from the military-grade micro-recorders I planted under your mattress and inside your luxury vehicle. I heard every single whispered insult. I heard every cruel joke you made about dumping me in a state ward. I heard you planning to steal my legacy and leave me to rot without even remembering my own name." The corrupt notary let out a pathetic whimper. He scrambled backward, grabbed the brass handle of the study doors, and desperately tried to pull them open, but they were firmly locked from the outside. He flattened himself against the wall, sliding down to the floor in a miserable, trembling heap. But the tall syndicate representative did not run. He was a professional predator, accustomed to using brute force to resolve complicated financial problems. He took a heavy, menacing step toward my desk, cracking his thick knuckles. His flat, dead eyes locked onto mine. "Listen to me, old man," the enforcer growled, his voice a deep, vibrating rumble of pure violence. "I do not care about your pathetic family drama. I do not care about audio tapes or medical reports. Your pathetic son owes my employers $12 million, and we are not leaving this mountain without the deed to this land. You are going to pick up that gold pen, and you are going to find the paper right now, or I am going to break every single bone in your hands before I do it for you." He reached inside his tailored suit jacket, revealing the dark, heavy grip of a suppressed firearm tucked into his shoulder holster. Derek let out a sharp cry. cry of panic, stepping back from the desk, completely willing to let this violent criminal assault his own father just to save himself. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at the enforcer and offered a cold, unforgiving smile. "You are not going to break anything," I replied smoothly, "and you are definitely not getting this land." Before the enforcer could pull his weapon, a massive thunderous crash echoed through the grand hallway. The heavy oak doors of my study were violently kicked open, splintering the thick wooden frame. The doors slammed against the interior walls with a deafening crack. Jonathan Pierce strode into the room, his face set in a mask of absolute righteous fury. He was not alone. Pouring into the study behind him were more than a dozen heavily armed federal agents and state police officers. They moved with terrifying practiced efficiency. Weapons were drawn and leveled at every single person in the room. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," a commanding voice shouted over the chaos. "Keep your hands where we can see them. Drop to the floor immediately." The syndicate enforcer froze, his hand hovering inches from his weapon. He slowly raised his hands in the air, realizing he was entirely outgunned. Two heavily armored agents rushed forward, slamming him forcefully against the mahogany desk and securing his wrists in heavy steel cuffs. The corrupt notary was weeping loudly on the floor as an officer hauled him to his feet. Derek collapsed to his knees, his perfectly tailored suit wrinkling against the intricately patterned rug. His chest heaved with rapid, panicked breaths. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic pleading. "Dad." "What is happening?" he sobbed, reaching a trembling hand out toward me. "Please, Dad, you have to stop them. Tell them it is a mistake." I walked around the massive desk and stood directly over him. I looked down at the boy I had loved, the boy I had spoiled, and felt absolutely nothing but a cold, heavy emptiness. "I am not going to stop them, Derek," I said, my voice cutting through the noise of the chaotic room. "I orchestrated this. I invited them here to witness the final consequence of your staggering greed. You thought you were so incredibly smart. You thought you had orchestrated the perfect, untraceable crime. You thought you were going to sell this mountain estate to the Zenith Corporation for $40 million, pay off your $12 million gambling debt to the cartel, and vanish into the wind with millions to spare." Derek stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "How do you know about Zenith?" he gasped. I leaned down closer, making absolutely sure he heard every single syllable. "Because I am Zenith," I stated clearly. "I am the silent majority shareholder of the parent holding company that controls it. You were desperately trying to sell my own land back to my own corporation. And as of yesterday afternoon, I finalized another massive transaction. I used a private shell company to buy your entire outstanding debt directly from the Vegas syndicate. The cartel does not own your life anymore, Derek. You owe me $12 million. And since you just committed felony wire fraud, severe elder abuse, and attempted poisoning across state lines, you are going to pay me back from a federal prison cell." Monica let out a piercing, hysterical scream as a female agent forcefully grabbed her arms, twisting them behind her back and snapping cold steel cuffs around her delicate wrists. "You cannot do this to me," she shrieked, thrashing wildly against the officer. "I am your family." I turned my cold gaze toward her. "Family protects each other, Monica. You fed me heavy antipsychotics and smiled while you did it. You are nothing but a parasite, and your free ride is permanently over." Two agents hauled Derek up from the rug, ignoring his desperate, blubbering cries for mercy. He looked back at me one last time as they dragged him toward the splintered doors, finally realizing that his father was never a victim. I simply turned my back to him, folded my hands neatly behind my back, and stared out the window. The crushing weight of their betrayal was finally beautifully lifted. The grand estate was completely mine once again, and the toxic poison had been entirely eradicated from my world. The long, brutal war was over. The heavy oak doors of the study remained splintered and broken, a physical reminder of their treacherous scheme. Derek was still kneeling on the intricately patterned rug, The federal agents momentarily loosened their grip to allow him to stand, but his legs refused to support his weight. He looked up at me with tears streaming down his pale face. "Dad, please," he sobbed, his voice cracking into a high whine. "You cannot let them take me away. I will do anything you want. I will work for you for the rest of my life to pay back every single cent. Just tell them to drop the charges. Please, I am your only son." I stared down at him, feeling the absolute absence of pity in my chest. "You made your choice, Derek," I said smoothly, my voice cold and unwavering. "You chose to drug me. You tried to steal my life. You brought a cartel to my door. You are not my son anymore. You are facing the absolute consequence of your incredible greed." An agent pulled him roughly to his feet, ignoring his desperate pleas for mercy. Behind him, Monica was putting up a fierce struggle. She thrashed wildly against the female agent who was leading her out of the room. "You are a horrible, vindictive old man," Monica shrieked, her face red with pure rage. "We were only trying to help you protect your assets." Her delusions were so deeply ingrained that she actually believed her own pathetic lies. I did not dignify her hysterical screaming with a response. I simply stood behind my mahogany desk and watched in absolute silence as the heavy steel handcuffs clicked securely around her wrists. The metallic sound echoed beautifully. The federal agents dragged them out into the hallway. The corrupt notary was marched out next, weeping loudly. The syndicate enforcer was led out last, his face bruised from the desk. He gave me one final glare, but I knew he was powerless. Jonathan Pierce had already wired the $15 million to his superiors in Las Vegas. The cartel had their money, and they would never bother me again. They had completely washed their hands of Derek. I was entirely mine to destroy. I walked slowly to the large window and looked out at the courtyard. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the frost-covered pine trees. I watched as my son and his wife were forced into the back of separate vehicles. Their heads were pushed down by the agents. The doors slammed shut with a heavy finality. The vehicles turned around and drove slowly down the gravel driveway, disappearing into the dense mountain forest. They were gone. The toxic poison had been entirely excised from my sanctuary. Jonathan walked back into the study, instructing the remaining agents to collect the audio receiver and the physical documents for the trial. He walked over to my desk and placed a supportive hand on my shoulder. "You did what you had to do, Harrison," he murmured softly. "If you had not set this trap, they would have successfully locked you away by tomorrow morning. You saved your own life today." I nodded slowly, turning my gaze to the cold ashes in the fireplace. "I know I did, Jonathan," I replied. "But it is a terrible thing for a father to realize his greatest enemy was the child he raised." The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, extensive police interviews, and grueling financial audits. The audio recordings I had captured were absolutely devastating. They provided undeniable, crystal-clear evidence of premeditated wire fraud, criminal conspiracy, and severe elder abuse. The toxicology report, detailing the heavy antipsychotic drugs in my system, solidified the attempted poisoning charges. Derek and Monica tried to hire expensive defense attorneys, but their funds were completely frozen. My shell company legally owned Derek's $12 million debt, and I immediately placed a lien on their luxury home, their vehicles, and all their remaining bank accounts. They were left with nothing. They were forced to rely on overworked public defenders who took one look at the evidence and immediately advised them to seek a plea deal. I refused to accept any plea deal that did not include significant prison time. I instructed the district attorney to prosecute them to the absolute fullest extent of the law. I attended every single court hearing. I sat comfortably in the front row, wearing a tailored suit, looking perfectly sharp and absolutely lucid. Derek could not even bring himself to look me directly in the eye. He sat at the defense table, his shoulders slumped, his arrogance completely shattered. He looked exactly like the broken, helpless man he had tried to turn me into. Fast forward exactly 6 months. The criminal trial officially concluded yesterday afternoon. The judge did not show them a single ounce of leniency. He called their actions a masterclass in profound cruelty and unchecked greed. Derek was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal prison without the possibility of early parole. Monica, who desperately tried to claim she was manipulated by her husband, was sentenced to 8 years for her active role in the poisoning and the conspiracy. As the judge read their sentences, the courtroom was completely silent. I felt a profound, heavy sense of closure wash over my tired soul. Today, I am standing alone on the expansive, wraparound porch of my mountain estate. The crisp, clean Colorado air fills my lungs. The towering pine trees sway gently in the afternoon breeze. The profound silence of the property is no longer a painful reminder of my loneliness. It is a beautiful, hard-won peace. My mind is perfectly sharp. My hands are completely steady. I am 70 years old, and I have never felt more alive. This morning I finalized a massive financial transfer with Jonathan. I donated $20 million to a national charity dedicated to protecting vulnerable seniors from financial exploitation and familial abuse. I established a secure legal foundation in Patricia's name, ensuring that her memory will bring genuine salvation to those who cannot defend themselves against the monsters living in their own homes. The remaining $30 million is safely secured in my blind trusts, ready to fund my quiet, peaceful existence for the rest of my days. I look out over the sprawling 500 acres of prime real estate that my son tried so desperately to steal from me. He thought he was entitled to my life simply because he shared my blood. He thought my unconditional love made me blind, weak, and easily manipulated. He learned the hardest lesson a man can ever learn. By removing the poison from my world, I did not destroy my legacy. I completely purified it. The foundation I built with Patricia remains solid, untouched by corruption or deceit. I survived the darkest betrayal a father could ever face, and I emerged entirely victorious. The estate is mine. The future is mine. And my mind belongs completely to me for the rest of my life. Blood does not guarantee loyalty, and a parent's unconditional love should never be a blindfold against the truth. We spend our lives building foundations to protect our children, assuming they will protect us when we become fragile. But true character is revealed not when someone is handed the world, but when they believe they hold absolute power over the vulnerable. Never underestimate the sharp mind of a seasoned elder. Forgiveness is a virtue, but accountability is a necessity. Protect your legacy, guard your mind, and remember that sometimes the most profound act of love is letting monsters face their consequences. If Harrison's ruthless pursuit of justice satisfied you, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories. Have you ever had to cut a toxic family member out of your life? Share your personal experience in the comments below. Let us support each other today.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my Father's daughter. In every step I take, in every time I choose to stand, when it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low, but the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my Father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my Father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly.